It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at AmericasVoiceNow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Welcome, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our second segment this hour, and we're going to cover the ground of perhaps what has become the one area where we as Americans can clearly and definitively point to the treason of certain members of our government. Open, blatant, undeclared, but obvious empirical treason. I know that that word is the kind of thing that strikes frustration, fear, anger in some. I got to tell you, I've had people say to me, you know, you've used that word treason too much. And I have to tell you, more than not, I've had more people tell me the other way around. You don't use it enough. The truth is, it's time to expose what is really happening here. It is time to expose the betrayal of the oath of office of everyone who is currently in government who is operating in those formats. Now, John Kerry came out yesterday and made a statement at the United Nations that he plans to sign this controversial UN treaty on small arms on Wednesday. What is today? Wednesday. This came out of a senior State Department official. And, you know, there have been a lot of warnings that have been sent through from Congress and from the Senate to not do it. That they won't ratify it. And I got to tell you, it better not be ratified. Because if it is, every senator who's participated in the ratification of that document will be guilty of treason, and it will be an open declared war against Americans as enemies of the state. One of the State Department officials came out and said that the treaty would, quote, reduce the risk that international transfers of conventional arms will be used to carry out the world's worst crimes. Hey, guess what? I don't care what the world does. I do care that our Second Amendment is respected and that it is honored. Nothing else matters. Because the Second Amendment was put in place for a clear and specific reason. To protect this body of Americans against tyranny and treason in government. And if you try to take it, that will prove to every one of us that we must employ it. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the truth. The Second Amendment was put in place by the founders, not for hunting, not for sporting, not for target practice. It was put in place so that you could defend yourself, your home, your family, your community, your city, your county, your state, and ultimately our nation. Any other interpretation is a lie. There is so much empirical documented evidence of our founders' true intent on the Second Amendment that anyone who declares something other than that is either a liar or willingly misinformed. Willingly, because that means that they have refused to understand and look at the truth and the empirical facts behind why the Second Amendment was created. The treaty, this official says, builds on decades of cooperative efforts to stem the international, illegal, and illicit trades in conventional weapons that benefit terrorists and rogue agents. Well, that explains a lot. Because if you notice the tone and the tenor that's been coming out of the Pentagon, the Department of State, this administration in general, the NSA, the IRS, they consider every American at this point to be a domestic terrorist. If you hand out copies of the Constitution at your school or at your church, if you were driving around with a Ron Paul bumper sticker here in Missouri, they declared you to be a domestic terrorist. If you have food stored, you're a domestic terrorist. If you farm your land, you are a domestic terrorist. If you speak out about your government and attempt to redress your grievances, you are a domestic terrorist. And so what they don't tell you in a statement like that is, and let's read it in its true context, the treaty builds on decades of cooperative efforts to stem the international illegal and illicit trades in conventional weapons that benefit terrorists and rogue agents. What that really should say is, this treaty builds on decades of cooperative efforts by the United Nations and other international rogues to ban the illegal and illicit trade in conventional arms that benefit domestic terrorists in the United States of America and rogue agents such as patriots, farmers, constitutional believers, people who believe that it's okay to question your government. Now, James Inhofe from Oklahoma, he has long claimed that the treaty will lead to new gun control measures. And mark my words, there is absolutely no doubt about it, it will. He sent a letter to Kerry declaring that any signature on this small arms treaty will be dead in the water, since a majority of the senators have already gone on record against the agreement and against the signature and ratification of it. What he writes here is, this administration is wasting precious time trying to sign away our laws to the global community and unelected UN bureaucrats. Kerry is currently attending the UN General Assembly session in New York this week. And he announced earlier this year that the administration planned to sign the treaty. Now, it's interesting that they're going to try to get John Kerry to sign it, not Obama. The treaty would require that countries that ratify it, listen to this, establish national regulations to control the transfer of conventional arms and components, that includes bullets and magazines and everything else, and to regulate arms brokers. Now, does that go all the way down to the local FFL? We don't know. Because what we do know is this. When this thing gets passed, you're going to see the same kind of work done like you did in Obamacare to create literally tens of thousands of pages of regulations that will implement this in the most onerous ways possible against America. Now, the treaty does not explicitly control domestic use of weapons in any country, but what it does do is it makes the national government of every state, that's the way that the UN terms every country that's a signatory on it, that it requires every state to implement full firearms registration. So what they'll do is they'll turn around and they'll say, well, look, as a result of this treaty, we've got to put in a registration requirement that every gun has to be registered with the state. Ladies and gentlemen, when that day comes, America had better rise up. Gun supporters on Capitol Hill are warning that the treaty will be used as the basis for more gun regulations in the U.S. They're right. We don't have to question that. All we got to do is look at the fake science behind climate change and see how Obama is utilizing that to pass executive order after executive order, even though we're not a signatory to the climate change treaty. He's doing the same darn thing with guns, and he's been doing it. How many executive orders has this traitor-in-chief, the usurper-in-chief, the illegal alien who occupies the White House, how many executive orders has he already put out there Over the summer, 130 members of Congress signed a letter to Obama and Kerry, urging them to not sign this treaty. Not only for this issue about, how it's going to affect gun regulations in the United States, but for other reasons, because basically what it does is it turns our sovereignty as a federal government, as a nation, over to these tin pot dictators in the United Nations. And I got to tell you, I don't want anyone in the United Nations telling Americans what to do. What the impact will be, nobody really knows. First, it will only take effect after 50 countries ratify it. Well, we're not going to be one of them, I can tell you that. And if we are one of them, then America needs to say, we've had enough. We're taking our government back. The truth is, we don't know how they're going to implement it. But I can tell you this, based on what we saw with the healthcare law, based on what we've seen with global warming, based on every law that has been passed by this administration, which has then been turned into this monstrous information-seeking, registration-based type of dossier building, the NSA and their secret spying and surveillance on Americans, nothing good can come from it. Nothing. The ideologues in this administration will utilize this as an opportunity to build a series of legislation that will make the ATF the new Homeland Security. You watch and see. The Control Arms Coalition, that's a group that includes hundreds of NGO organizations, non-governmental organizations, in over 100 countries. All of them are promoting the Arms Trade Treaty. And they're expecting countries like Britain, Germany, and France and the United States to sign, along with exporters like Brazil and Mexico. Now, the truth is, let's be honest. The treaty states that it covers battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, large caliber artillery weapons, combat aircraft, attack helicopters, warships, missiles, missile launchers, and, here it comes, small arms and light weapons. And their accoutrements. So that means ammunition bans. That means magazine bans. That means bans on semi-automatics. That means registration of everything all the way down to the plinking .22 you go out and hunt rabbit with. The truth of the matter is this, America. This is the New World Order in spades. If this treaty is signed, it tells you, and it should be dealt with and treated like exactly what it is, an open declaration of war against we the people. It will ban all the importation of all firearms into the United States. The treaty also requires countries to take measures to prevent the diversion of conventional weapons to the illicit market. So just imagine how the people over at the ATF and Homeland Security will treat that language. This is one of the provisions that the gun rights supporters in Congress who signed that letter to the president were explicitly talking about. Now, Senator Bob Corker, he's a Republican from Tennessee, he came out and he warned the Obama administration against any action that they would try to utilize to implement UN Arms Trade Treaty requirements without Senate advice and consent. In other words, no more executive orders. Asserting the Senate's constitutional role on treaties, U.S. Senator Bob Corker, Republican out of Tennessee, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, in a letter today, this is yesterday, by the way, warned the Obama administration against taking any action to implement the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty without Senate advice and consent. Quote, the AAT raises significant legislative and constitutional questions. Any act to implement this treaty, provisionally or otherwise, before the Congress provides its advice and consent, would be fundamentally inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution, law, and practice. Here's the actual letter he wrote. I'm going to read it to you. It's not that long. Dear President Obama, it is my understanding that Secretary of State John Kerry will sign the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty on behalf of the United States. The ATT, Arms Trade Treaty, raises significant legislative and constitutional questions. Any act to implement this treaty, provisionally or otherwise, before the Congress provides its advice and consent, would be inconsistent with the United States Constitution, law, and practice. As you know, Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution requires the United States Senate to provide its advice and consent before a treaty becomes binding under United States law. The Senate has not yet provided its advice and consent and may not provide such consent. As a result, the executive branch is not authorized to take any steps to implement the treaty. Moreover, even after the Senate provides its advice and consent, certain treaties require changes to United States law in the form of legislation passed by both the House and the Senate. The ATT is such a treaty. Various provisions of the ATT, including but not limited to those related to the regulation of imports and trade in conventional arms, require such implementing legislation and relate to matters exclusively reserved to Congress under our Constitution. Because of the concerns discussed above, as well as the fundamental issues that the ATT raises with respect to the individual rights protected by the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, as the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it is my view that you may not take any executive action to implement this treaty, provisionally or otherwise, unless and until, 1, the United States Senate has provided its constitutionally required advice and consent to its ratification, and 2, the Congress has passed any and all required legislation to bring this treaty into effect under United States domestic law. Quite frankly, while I applaud Senator Corker's statement, my argument with that is that, quite frankly, it's not strongly worded enough. Corker and every other senator, they need to begin to use the right word in describing the AAT. And the violation of the Constitution that it will create and force upon America. The word, ladies and gentlemen, is treason. Treason against your oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America. Because the Second Amendment of the Constitution says that no one, Congress, executive, legislative, judicial, anyone, especially a foreign agency, may infringe upon the rights of Americans. In fact, it says very clearly, shall not be infringed. Shall is a definitive word. It leaves no room to brook argument in any way, shape, or form. The word shall is so definitive that in law it is construed to mean must. Must. So when we talk about the issue of Second Amendment, the government, any government, must not infringe. Folks, that says pretty much all that you need to know. You must not infringe. Now, we know that the truth is we've seen it before where the administration is essentially implementing international treaties without the assistance or the ratification, I should say, of the Senate. The perfect example is the climate change treaties that are out there, the Kyoto protocols and all that other nonsense. We've made it clear that the United States of America is not willing and or accepting of the issues surrounding the climate change arguments. And so as a result, why is it that the government institutes everything that those treaties require without the consent of the people and the Congress itself? I got to tell you something. I wrote an article out there, and you can type this into your browser. The principle of mutually assured destruction versus the Dick Act and other Second Amendment myth. And I'm going to read some sections out of it because I want you to understand the importance of what this is actually talking about. And I want you to understand fully that the principles of the Second Amendment were very, very clearly outlined for us. And it was beyond any question in anyone's mind during the days that the Constitution was actually created and sworn off, that the Second Amendment was not to be infringed. And so I'm going to explore that with you a little bit because I think it's very important that you understand that the issue here is not whether or not we have some kind of a magic bullet that prevents the federal government from subverting our Second Amendment rights. The truth is, the Constitution already gives us that. And if, for whatever reason, this government, and I don't care whether you lay it on senators' laps or whether you lay it on Obama's lap or you lay it on anyone else's lap, including the courts, anyone else. No court, no Senate, no legislator, no executive has the power to limit that which is emphatically and clearly written. Shall not be infringed. End of discussion. We're going to explore this in just a minute. We're going to take a break. If you're just joining us, thank you. I want to make sure that I give you an update on one of our sponsors when we come back. But we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we'll wrap this segment up on gun control because I got to tell you, folks, we are here and looking at some dire information. If Kerry signs this thing, all bets are off, and we need to look at it for exactly what it is: an open declaration of war against the American people. We'll be back in just a moment. Stick with us.